My permanent subcommittee on investigations has spent about the last 10 years learning about tax avoidance schemes, which we estimate, and more importantly, other experts estimate, cost to the U.S. Treasury about $100 billion a year, or about $1 trillion over 10 years. It amounts to this. If there's an offshore bank which does not cooperate with our tax people, at that point our banks will be told that they can no longer do business with that offshore bank. And that means, for instance, that if the offshore banks will not have access to American credit cards through that American bank. But we will stop doing business with offshore banks that do not cooperate with our tax authorities and which impede U.S. tax enforcement. It's very hard now to prove control. The burden is now on our tax people, even though an American is the one who forms the corporation offshore, sends them assets, receives assets, or benefits from that offshore corporation. Nonetheless, you got to be able to have evidence of that and then prove control. What we do in Section 102 is create a rebuttable presumption that if you do any of those things, you are in control of that corporation for tax purposes. If you manage or control an offshore corporation from the United States, that you are going to be treated, the corporation will be treated as a domestic U.S. corporation for tax purposes. Right now, wherever you're incorporated determines if you're a U.S. corporation or not. So if you are incorporated in the U.S., we treat you as a U.S. corporation, but if you're incorporated in the Caymans, you're treated like a Cayman corporation. That's going to end. If you manage and control a foreign corporation from the United States, you are going to be treated as that will be treated as a U.S. corporation for tax purposes. You know, there's a lot of disagreement about how to reduce the deficit. But I think most people agree that clamping down on offshore tax abusers is one way to surely reduce the deficit. People talk about tax reform, and if people are serious about tax reform, these provisions are a very important part of tax reform. We've got to eliminate incentives for companies to move overseas. Right now there are too many tax incentives for companies to move jobs overseas, and we've got to eliminate those tax incentives. We've got to end the unfair discrimination that exists against companies that don't use these kind of gimmicks. It's very unfair, and we're going to hear more about that in a minute. But it's very unfair to companies which keep their companies here, don't go through this gimmickry of creating these offshore corporations to avoid paying taxes. It gives an unfair advantage to those who do over those who don't. The patriots who stay here should not be paying a tax price for staying here. That is not a burden which ought to be placed on their shoulders.